"Ma'am, you don't belong in this courtroom." The words landed sharp and cold, slicing through the quiet like a gavel striking wood. And for a moment, every head in the room turned toward the woman standing near the back row, as if she had broken some unspoken rule simply by being there. Ava Williams didn't move, not at first, her fingers resting lightly against the worn leather strap of her bag, her posture steady despite the weight of a dozen unfamiliar eyes pressing down on her. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting a pale, almost sterile glow across the polished benches and the flag standing rigid in the corner. Somewhere near the front, a clerk shuffled papers, the dry whisper of legal documents echoing louder than it should have. But no one spoke for a second, not until the officer near the aisle took a step closer, his shoes tapping against the tile with a rhythm that felt too loud for such a controlled space. "I said, you need to step outside," he repeated, his tone firmer now, edged with something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't respect either. Ava lifted her eyes then, calm, measured, meeting his gaze without flinching, and there was something in that stillness, something unhurried and grounded, that didn't match what everyone expected from someone being singled out like this. A quiet strength that didn't ask for permission to exist, the kind that made people uncomfortable when they couldn't explain it. Behind her, a man shifted in his seat, whispering something under his breath. A soft chuckle followed from somewhere to the left, quickly stifled but not unnoticed. The air in the courtroom seemed to tighten, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, watching, waiting. Ava exhaled slowly, the breath barely visible but deliberate, as though she were anchoring herself to something deeper than the moment unfolding around her. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice even, not raised, not defensive, just certain. And that certainty seemed to ripple outward in a way no one had prepared for. The officer paused, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to shift the rhythm of the room, enough for the silence to stretch a little longer than comfort allowed. A ceiling vent rattled faintly, the sound oddly loud in the pause, and somewhere near the front, a pen dropped against a desk, the sharp click echoing like punctuation. The officer cleared his throat, regaining his stance, his authority settling back into place like a uniform being straightened. "Not up to you," he replied, gesturing toward the aisle, his hand firm, practiced, as if this moment had already been decided before it began. Ava didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't step back either. She simply stood there, her presence steady in a room that had already judged her without knowing a single thing about her. And in that stillness, something subtle shifted, something beneath the surface, like a current no one could see but everyone could feel, the kind that comes just before something changes, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And as the officer took another step forward, the quiet hum of the courtroom seemed to deepen, stretching thin, like the moment itself was holding its breath, waiting for something no one yet understood. The officer's hand lingered in the air for a brief moment before dropping back to his side, as if even he was unsure why the space between them suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Ava Williams adjusted her grip on the strap of her bag, the worn leather creasing softly beneath her fingers, a small detail that spoke of years of use, of quiet routines and long days that no one in this room had ever cared to imagine. Her shoes were simple, slightly scuffed at the edges, standing firmly against the polished courtroom floor that reflected the overhead lights in faint, distorted lines. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply remained. And that stillness seemed to press against the room in a way that made people shift in their seats without realizing why. Near the front row, a woman in a tailored suit leaned toward her colleague and whispered something that ended in a faint, dismissive smile, while a man 2 seats down tapped his pen against a legal pad, the rhythmic sound cutting through the silence like a quiet metronome. Ava's eyes moved slowly across the room, not searching for approval, not looking for support, just observing, taking in the polished wood, the elevated bench at the front, the empty chair behind it that everyone seemed to glance at without thinking, as if it carried more weight than the rest of the room combined. "Last warning," the officer said, his voice lower now, controlled, but with a tension that had not been there before. "Step outside until the judge arrives." Ava tilted her head slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate, as though she were considering not the command itself but the assumption behind it. The idea that she needed to wait, to be told when she was allowed to exist within this space. A quiet breath left her lips, steady and measured, and when she spoke again, her voice carried just enough to reach the front of the room without ever rising above it. The judge is already here. A few heads lifted at that, confusion flickering across faces that had only moments ago been certain of their understanding. The officer let out a short breath, almost a laugh, though it lacked any real humor. "That is not how this works," he replied, gesturing again toward the aisle. But this time the motion felt less certain, less anchored, as if something small had shifted beneath his footing. Somewhere near the clerk's desk, papers were shuffled again, faster now, less organized, and the clerk glanced toward the hallway beyond the courtroom doors, checking the time, checking the absence of someone who had not yet arrived. The ticking of the wall clock became noticeable then, each second marking a gap that no one had expected to feel. Ava's gaze followed that glance for a brief moment before returning to the center of the room, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But there was something deeper there now, something that suggested she was not waiting for permission, only for the moment to catch up with the truth she already carried. The officer hesitated again, just a fraction, but enough for the room to feel it, enough for the silence to stretch just a little longer than it should have. And in that space, the certainty that had filled the courtroom at the start began to thin, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, like a question forming that no one had yet found the courage to ask. The faint ticking of the wall clock grew louder, not because it had changed, but because the room had. The quiet now stretched thin across polished wood and pressed suits, and every second seemed to underline the same question that no one wanted to ask out loud. Where was the judge? The clerk shifted again, this time standing halfway from their chair, eyes fixed on the double doors at the back of the courtroom, as if expecting them to open at any second. But they did not. The handle remained still, untouched, and that absence began to settle into something heavier than a delay. Ava Williams did not look toward the doors again. Her attention stayed forward, steady, grounded, like someone who had already arrived at a destination the rest of the room had yet to recognize. The officer near her exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that carried a hint of impatience. But beneath it there was something else now, something quieter, less certain. "We are not doing this," he said, though his voice lacked the finality it had carried before. He glanced briefly toward the front, toward the empty bench, then back at Ava, as if seeking confirmation from a space that offered none. A man seated in the second row leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze narrowing slightly, not in judgment this time, but in curiosity, as if something about the moment no longer aligned with his expectations. A low murmur began to ripple through the room, subtle at first, then spreading in soft waves, fragments of conversation that rose and fell like distant echoes. "Is there a delay?" someone whispered. "Did something happen?" Another voice followed. The uncertainty was no longer hidden. It moved openly now, threading its way between the rows. The officer straightened his posture, reclaiming what control he could. "You need to step outside until we sort this out," he said again. But the words felt rehearsed now, repeated without the same authority. Ava turned her head slightly, not toward him, but toward the front of the room, her gaze settling on the elevated bench. The chair behind it remained empty, its dark wood catching the overhead light in sharp, clean lines, a symbol of authority that stood untouched, waiting. But for what? She took a slow step forward then, just one, the sound of her shoe against the floor soft but distinct, enough to cut through the murmurs and draw attention back to her. The officer reacted immediately, stepping to the side to block her path, though not as forcefully as before. There was hesitation now, a fraction of doubt that had not existed moments ago. "Ma'am," he started, but the word faltered halfway, as if even he was unsure how to finish it. Ava stopped, not because she had been stopped, but because she chose to. Her eyes lifted slightly, meeting his again, calm, unwavering. And in that quiet exchange something shifted once more, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, the kind of shift that happens when certainty begins to unravel. Somewhere behind the clerk's desk, a phone buzzed sharply against the surface, the sudden sound cutting clean through the tension. The clerk glanced down, hesitated, then answered, their voice low, urgent, barely audible. But their expression changed almost immediately, confusion giving way to something sharper, something closer to realization. They looked up then, scanning the room, their gaze moving past the officer, past the rows of seated spectators, until it landed on Ava Williams. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause. The murmurs faded, the clock ticked, and the space between what people believed and what was true narrowed to a single breath. The clerk's hand tightened slightly around the phone, their knuckles paling against the plastic as they listened, eyes still locked on Ava Williams as though the answer they were hearing had been standing in front of them all along. A quiet, yes, understood, slipped from their lips before they lowered the receiver slowly, more carefully than necessary, as if any sudden movement might break whatever fragile realization had just settled into place. The room had gone still again, not the earlier kind of silence filled with judgment, but something heavier, more uncertain, like a shift in gravity that no one could quite adjust to yet. The officer noticed it too, his gaze flicking from the clerk to Ava and back again, searching for a cue, a signal, something to re-establish the structure he was used to operating within. What is it? He asked, his voice lower now, controlled but edged with unease. The clerk hesitated, just for a second, then straightened, their posture changing in a way that suggested they were no longer simply observing but stepping into something official, something that required precision. There has been a change, they said, their voice carrying just enough to reach the front rows. Though it was not loud, it did not need to be. Every ear in the room was already tuned to them. The officer frowned slightly. What kind of change? He pressed, but the question seemed to hang unanswered for a beat too long. The clerk's eyes moved again, not scanning this time, not uncertain, but direct, steady, landing once more on Ava. And in that gaze there was recognition now, not assumption, not dismissal, something clearer, more grounded in fact than perception. Ava did not react outwardly. Her posture remained composed, her hands relaxed at her sides, but there was a quiet readiness in the way she stood, as if she had been waiting not for permission, but for acknowledgement. The murmur that had been building in the room softened into a tense hush. People leaned slightly forward, some turning in their seats to follow the line of the clerk's sight, trying to understand what they had missed, what had been in front of them this entire time without being seen. The officer shifted his weight, his stance no longer as firm, his authority now sharing space with doubt. If there is an issue, we can delay proceedings, he said, though his words felt like an attempt to regain control rather than a solution. The clerk shook their head faintly, a small motion but decisive. There will be no delay, they replied, and something in the tone made the room still even further. Ava took another step forward then, unhurried, measured, the sound of her movement soft but unmistakable against the floor. The officer instinctively moved again, but slower this time, as if unsure whether to block her or follow her lead. His hand lifted slightly, then paused midair, caught between action and hesitation. Ava stopped just within reach, her gaze meeting his once more, not confrontational, not yielding, simply present. You are standing in the way of this court, she said quietly, and the words, though calm, carried a weight that pressed into the space around them. The officer's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the fracture in his certainty behind him. The clerk took a small step forward, their voice clearer now, cutting through the tension with official clarity. All rise, they called, and the command moved through the room like a wave, chairs scraping softly against the floor as people stood almost automatically. Though many did so with confusion still written across their faces, the officer froze, just for a moment, his body caught between instinct and realization, and in that pause, the distance between what he thought he understood and what was actually unfolding narrowed to nothing at all. The sound of chairs sliding against the floor faded into a strained stillness as every person in the courtroom rose, some slowly, some abruptly, but all with the same lingering uncertainty written across their faces, eyes shifting, searching, trying to reconcile what they had just heard with what they believed was happening. The officer remained where he stood, his body upright out of habit, but his mind clearly catching up a second too late, his hand still slightly raised from the motion he never completed. Ava Williams did not rush. She did not look around to measure the room's reaction. She simply stepped forward, one measured step at a time, her pace steady, controlled, the soft rhythm of her shoes against the floor now the only sound that seemed to matter. The space in front of her began to open without instruction, people instinctively moving just enough to clear her path, not because they were told to, but because something in the air had shifted beyond argument. The officer turned slightly as she passed, his eyes following her now, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with something closer to disbelief, as though he were watching a moment unfold that he could not undo. The clerks stood straighter behind their desk, their hands now still, no longer shuffling papers, no longer searching for answers, because the answer was already moving through the room in real time. Ava approached the front, the elevated bench rising before her, its polished surface catching the overhead light in a way that felt almost symbolic now, not distant, not untouchable, but waiting. The courtroom remained standing, but the silence had changed. It was no longer filled with quiet judgment. It carried weight now, awareness, the kind that presses into the chest and slows the breath. Ava paused for a fraction of a second at the base of the steps, not hesitating, but acknowledging the space, the gravity of it, the years of decisions, voices, and consequences that had passed through this very spot. Then she moved again, ascending with the same calm precision, each step deliberate, grounded, as if she had walked this path many times before, because in truth, she had, just not in front of them, not in a way they had allowed themselves to see. Behind her, the officer's shoulders shifted, tension settling in, his posture no longer anchored in certainty, his gaze fixed now on the figure he had tried to move moments ago, the figure who now stood where authority lived. The clerk's voice came again, softer this time, but clear, carrying the final confirmation that no one in the room could ignore. Court is now in session. The words landed differently now, heavier, real. Ava reached the chair and turned, facing the room, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, not triumphant, not resentful, simply present, and that presence held more power than anything spoken so far. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the bench, her gaze moving across the courtroom, meeting the eyes that had once dismissed her, and in that quiet exchange, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The officer lowered his hand fully now, the motion slow, almost reluctant, as if letting go of something he had not realized he was holding. The room remained standing, but no one shifted anymore, no one whispered, no one questioned, because the truth had already taken its seat, and it did not need to explain itself. No one sat down immediately, even after the clerk's voice settled into silence, as if the room itself needed a moment to understand what had just happened. The air felt different now, heavier but clearer, like a fog that had finally lifted without anyone noticing when it began. Ava Williams lowered herself into the chair with calm precision, the soft sound of wood meeting fabric barely audible, yet it seemed to echo across the courtroom in a way that no raised voice ever could. Her hands rested lightly on the bench, fingers relaxed, steady, the faint reflection of the overhead lights tracing along the polished surface beneath them. She did not rush to speak, did not assert control through volume or force. Instead, she allowed the silence to exist, to stretch just long enough for everyone present to feel it, to sit inside it, the kind of silence that does not demand attention but commands it anyway. The officer remained standing near the aisle, his posture still upright, but no longer rigid. His shoulders had lowered slightly, the tension that once defined his stance now replaced by something quieter, something unsettled. His gaze shifted once more toward Ava, but this time he did not look through her. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, and that recognition carried a weight he had not prepared for. Across the room, a man adjusted his tie without realizing it. A woman smoothed the edge of her sleeve, small movements that betrayed the discomfort settling into the space, not because something was wrong, but because something had been revealed, something that challenged the assumptions they had walked in with. The clerk finally sat, the motion slow, deliberate, their eyes still flicking up toward the bench as if confirming that what they were witnessing was real. The clock continued its steady ticking, each second now marking not anticipation, but presence. Ava's gaze moved across the courtroom again, not lingering on any one person, not searching for acknowledgement, simply observing, grounded in the role she carried whether others recognized it or not. She inhaled slowly, the breath subtle but controlled, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, filling the room without rising above it. "You may be seated." The words were simple, expected even, but the way they landed carried something deeper, something that shifted the room once more. People began to sit, one by one, the sound of chairs returning to the floor softer now, more careful, as if the room itself had learned something in the last few moments. The officer hesitated, just a fraction, before following, lowering himself into place with a movement that lacked its earlier certainty, his hands resting against his knees, fingers still, eyes forward but unfocused for a brief second, as though replaying everything that had led him here. Ava reached for the gavel, her hand steady, not dramatic, not forceful, and brought it down with a single, controlled motion. The sound was clear, firm, final, cutting clean through the air and settling into the space like a marker of truth, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. And in that moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of assumption. It was a place of clarity, and no one in the room could pretend otherwise. The echo of the gavel seemed to linger longer than the sound itself, settling into the walls, into the polished wood, into the quiet space between breaths. And for a moment, no one moved, not because they were told not to, but because something in the room had shifted beyond instruction. Ava Williams remained still behind the bench, her posture upright, composed, her presence now fully occupying the space that had once stood empty, her eyes lifted, steady, not scanning for reaction but acknowledging it without needing to. The courtroom, once filled with quiet assumptions, now carried a different kind of awareness, one that pressed gently but firmly against every person present. The officer sat near the aisle, his hands resting against his knees, fingers slightly curled as if holding on to something unseen, his gaze fixed forward, but not on any document, not on any person. Instead, it lingered somewhere between the past few minutes and the reality now unfolding in front of him, as if his mind was trying to reconcile the distance between those 2 points. Across the room, a man cleared his throat softly, then stopped, as if even that small sound felt out of place. A woman shifted in her seat, her eyes lowering briefly before lifting again toward the bench. Drawn back by something she could not ignore, the clerk adjusted a stack of papers, aligning the edges carefully, deliberately, each movement controlled, almost ritualistic, as if restoring order to something that had quietly unraveled. Ava reached forward slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of a file placed neatly before her, the paper crisp, untouched. Waiting, she opened it with a measured motion, the soft sound of pages turning filling the silence in a way that felt grounding, anchoring the room back into its purpose. But the weight of what had just happened did not disappear. It remained, just beneath the surface, present in every glance, every breath, every subtle shift of posture. Ava's voice came again, calm, even, carrying with it not just authority, but clarity. "Before we proceed," she said, her gaze lifting from the document, settling forward, not targeting, not accusing, simply present. "There is something this court needs to address." The words hung in the air, not heavy, not sharp, but deliberate, and the room responded without moving, attention tightening, focus narrowing. The officer's shoulders shifted slightly, a reflex he did not seem aware of, his breath slower now, more measured, as if preparing for something he could not yet define. Ava's eyes moved briefly toward him, not lingering, but enough to acknowledge his place in the room, enough to include him within the scope of what was about to be said, and then back to the center, her hands resting calmly against the bench, fingers still, grounded. "A courtroom is built on respect," she continued, her voice steady, not raised, not emotional, but firm in a way that did not need emphasis. Not just for the law, but for every person who steps inside it. The statement was simple, almost obvious, yet in this moment, it carried a weight that pressed into the room in a way no argument could. The officer lowered his gaze briefly, just for a second, his eyes dropping to the floor before lifting again. The movement small, but undeniable, The kind of motion that comes when something has been understood without being forced. Around him, others sat still. No whispers now, no shifting, just listening. Because what was being said was no longer about procedure, no longer about roles. It was about something deeper, something that could not be ignored once it had been seen. Ava paused, just long enough for the words to settle, not rushing. To fill the silence, allowing it to exist, to do its work. And in that pause, the courtroom felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, but aware, fully, unmistakably aware of the line that had been crossed and the truth now standing in its place. Ava Williams let the silence rest for one more breath before she moved again, not abruptly, not with force, but with the same measured control that had carried her through every moment since she entered the room. Her gaze steady as it returned to the center, then slowly shifted toward the aisle where the officer sat. The movement subtle yet unmistakable, drawing the attention of everyone present without a single word needing to guide it. The officer felt it before he fully understood it, his posture tightening slightly, his hands pressing more firmly against his knees as if grounding himself. Ava did not call him out by name, did not raise her voice, did not accuse. Instead, she simply acknowledged what had already happened. Authority is not a shield, she said calmly, her voice even, resonating through the room with quiet clarity. It is a responsibility. The words landed gently but firmly, not directed as a weapon, but as a truth that could not be dismissed. The officer's jaw shifted slightly, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal the tension beneath. The surface, his eyes lowered again for a brief moment, not out of command, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when something inside you aligns with something you can no longer deny. Across the room, no one moved, no one whispered. The earlier murmurs replaced by a stillness that carried weight, the kind of silence that listens. Ava's hands remained still on the bench, her posture unchanged, grounded, unwavering. This court does not measure people by appearance, by assumption, or by position, she continued, her tone steady, unwavering. It measures actions, and it protects dignity, equally. The statement did not rise, did not fall. It simply settled into the space, clear and complete, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire room exhaled without realizing it had been holding its breath. The officer lifted his gaze again, slowly this time, meeting the front of the room, not with defiance, not with resistance, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. His shoulders eased slightly, the rigid line of his posture softening just enough to show the shift within. Ava did not press further, did not extend the moment beyond what it needed to be. She allowed the truth to stand on its own, without embellishment, without repetition, and that restraint carried more weight than any prolonged speech ever could. The clerks sat still, their hands resting flat against the desk now, no longer moving, no longer adjusting, simply present, as if the room itself had settled into a new alignment. Ava's gaze moved once more across the courtroom, not searching for agreement, not expecting acknowledgement, but recognizing the shared space they all occupied, and the standard it now held. "We proceed," she said finally, her voice calm, grounded, the words simple but definitive, and as they settled into the air, the room responded, not with noise, not with motion, but with a quiet understanding that something had shifted permanently, something that would not be undone when the doors closed or the session ended, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. The room settled into a steady rhythm as papers moved. Voices remained low and controlled, and the structure of the courtroom finally resumed its intended purpose. But something fundamental had shifted beneath it all, something quiet yet permanent. Ava Williams remained composed behind the bench, her presence no longer questioned, no longer filtered through assumption, simply accepted as fact, as reality. The case before her unfolded with measured clarity, each word spoken carrying the weight of process. But beneath that process lingered the echo of what had just occurred, a silent reminder woven into every glance and every pause. The officer sat still for most of the proceedings, his posture upright, but no longer rigid, his attention focused, not out of obligation, but out of awareness, as though he were listening more carefully than he ever had before, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something reflective, The courtroom moved forward, questions asked, answers given, decisions framed within the boundaries of law. Yet the atmosphere remained different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, as if the space itself had been recalibrated. When the final matter of the session concluded, Ava closed the file in front of her with a soft, deliberate motion, the sound subtle but definitive. She reached for the gavel once more and brought it down gently, the tone clear, controlled, marking the end without excess. "Court is adjourned," she said, her voice calm, steady, and the words settled into the room like a final note. People began to stand, slower this time, more mindful. Conversations did not immediately rise. There was no rush to exit. Instead, there was a quiet unfolding, as if each person carried something with them that they had not expected to leave with. The officer remained seated for a brief moment longer than the others, his hands resting still, his gaze lowered before lifting once more toward the bench. Ava had already stood, stepping back from the chair with the same calm presence she had entered with. She did not look back, did not seek acknowledgement, her role complete in a way that required no further confirmation. The officer rose finally, his movement measured, his shoulders no longer tense, his steps slower as he turned toward the aisle, the polished floor reflecting faint traces of movement beneath him. He paused for just a second, glancing back toward the now empty bench, not with confusion, not with doubt, but with something closer to understanding, something that did not need to be spoken to be real. Around him, others filed out quietly, their voices low, their expressions thoughtful, the earlier energy of assumption replaced by a more grounded awareness. The courtroom itself began to empty, the hum of lights overhead returning to its usual background presence, the flag standing still in the corner, unchanged yet somehow different in what it represented to those who had just witnessed the moment. Outside the tall windows, daylight stretched across the steps of the building, casting long shadows that moved slowly with the passing hours, and as the last of the people exited, the room returned to silence. Not the same silence it held before, but one shaped by what had been seen, what had been understood, a silence that carried the quiet weight of justice, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, like a truth that no longer needed to prove itself.